I began forgetting my children's names in March, which is when I decided to forget them. And I forgot them with the specific consistency of a performance that I had been rehearsing since February, when I understood what my children were planning, and concluded that the most effective response was to let them believe the planning was succeeding. The first name I forgot was Nathan's. He came for his usual Tuesday visit. My son, Nathan Allen Hartman Oze, 49 years old, a commercial insurance broker in Denver, who had been coming on Tuesdays since I moved back to Colorado Springs the previous autumn, and who visited with the specific quality of someone who is attending to an obligation rather than to a relationship. I looked at him in the doorway and I said, "Oh, I'm sorry. I was expecting someone. Are you a friend of my son's?" He stared at me. "Nathan," he said. "Mom, I'm Nathan." I looked at him with the careful blankness of someone who is genuinely uncertain, which is an expression I had practiced in the bathroom mirror for 3 weeks. "Nathan," I said, as though the name were a piece of furniture in a room I had not been in for a long time. "Yes, of course, Nathan. Come in." He came in. He sat at the kitchen table. He looked at me with the expression of a man who has just received significant information. I offered him tea. I did not call him by name again during the visit. I asked him about his work in the general terms of someone who knows someone works but cannot place the specifics. I asked if he had driven far. I mentioned that someone had been by earlier and invented someone, and expressed mild confusion about who it had been. I left a silence at the end of sentences that were not quite complete, the specific quality of speech that trails rather than concludes. The visit lasted 40 minutes. Nathan's behavior across the 40 minutes shifted in a specific and observable way. In the first 10 minutes, he was attempting to correct my confusions, gently redirecting, supplying the information I appeared to be missing. By the middle 20 minutes, he had stopped correcting and had begun observing, the specific shift from engagement to assessment that happens when a person has received enough data to move from the individual instance to the pattern. By the last 10 minutes, he was quieter than I had ever seen Nathan, who is not a quiet man. He left. I watched his car from the study window. He sat in the driveway for 8 minutes before he drove away, which was the time of the phone call I mentioned. His sister Sandra visited the following Thursday. Sandra Claire Hartman Oze, 46 years old, who lives in Aurora and who works in healthcare administration, and who had, across the autumn and winter of the previous year, been the more active of the two in what I had come to think of as the campaign. I looked at Sandra in the doorway and I said, "Oh, hello. Are you from the church group?" Sandra said. "Mom, it's Sandra, your daughter." "Sandra," I said. Yes, yes. Come in." She came in. She sat at the kitchen table. She looked at me, and then she looked at the kitchen, at the organization of it, the things on the counter, the dishes in the rack. And I understood that she was conducting an inventory. I made tea. After the Sandra visit, I sat in my study and I reviewed what I knew. I knew this. Nathan had called Sandra from his car in the driveway after his Tuesday visit, and the call had been captured by the camera I had installed in the entryway, which is positioned to capture sound from the porch. I had listened to the call that evening. The call had lasted 11 minutes, and its contents had confirmed what I already suspected. My name is Beatrice Ellen Hartman Oze. I am 73 years old. I have no cognitive impairment of any kind. I have a PhD in psychology from the University of Colorado, which I completed in 1977, and I practiced as a clinical psychologist for 31 years, from 1977 to 2008, and since my retirement, I've maintained the professional literature through subscription and reading because the retirement of the title does not retire the understanding. I know how dementia presents. I know what the cognitive testing shows. I know what the behavioral indicators are and what the progression looks like and what the difference is between genuine cognitive impairment and the performance of cognitive impairment. I had been performing cognitive impairment for 3 weeks. I was getting quite good at it. The cameras had been in the house since January. I had installed them myself. 3 of them, small and unobtrusive, positioned to cover the living room, the kitchen, and the entryway. Because I had understood in December that what was happening required documentation. What had been happening in December was this. Nathan and Sandra had been, in their visits and phone calls, building a picture of me as someone who was struggling. The building was not aggressive. It was incremental, the way incremental things are when the person doing the incrementing is not yet ready to be explicit. They had asked with increasing frequency whether I was managing the bills. They had commented with increasing specificity on the house's condition, whether it was clean enough, whether the refrigerator was sufficiently stocked, whether I seemed to be eating regularly. They had mentioned, more than once, that the house was a lot for one person to manage. The house is a 3-bedroom house in a neighborhood that I have lived in since 1989. My husband Kwame Osei died in 2016, which is when the managing became mine alone, and I have managed it without significant difficulty since. In December I had heard, not on the cameras, which were not yet installed, but through the specific acoustic qualities of a house in which sound carries from the living room to the study when both doors are open and the house is quiet. Nathan and Sandra talking in the living room during a joint visit. They had believed I was napping. I was reading. What I heard through the walls in the quiet house was Nathan saying, "She's getting worse." The neighbor said she found her in the yard at 9 at night looking for her keys. I had been in the yard at 9 at night in December. I had gone to retrieve a garden tool I had left out, and a neighbor had spoken to me, but the conversation had been a normal one between 2 adults in a yard at evening. There was nothing confused about it. Nathan had reframed it. Sandra had said, "The house is too much for her. If we could get her moved somewhere managed, we'd have the house free too." She had stopped. Then she had said, "We should talk to someone about what the situation looks like legally." The specific phrase, "what the situation looks like legally," was the phrase that clarified what I was hearing. People who are concerned about a parent's well-being do not frame the concern in terms of legal appearance. They ask about medical options, about care arrangements, about what support the parent needs. The legal framing was the framing of people who are thinking about authority, about who controls what, rather than people who are thinking about care. I had put down my book and sat very still in my study. The cameras went up in January. The performance began in March. The cameras had captured, across the weeks of the performance, the evolution of Nathan's and Sandra's understanding. I had been reviewing the recordings every evening with the specific attention of a psychologist who is studying behavior, noting the shift in tone, the increased specificity of the inventory taking, the phone calls from the driveway and the porch in it, which they compared notes and developed their assessment. The assessment they had developed was, the old woman is confused and possibly demented, and the house is at risk of neglect, and something should be done. And the something should be done soon. I had been patiently feeding the assessment by continuing to forget their names. My friend Marianne Wolfe has been a practicing psychiatrist in Colorado Springs for 32 years. We met in graduate school in 1974 when we were both in the university's clinical program. She in psychiatry, I in psychology, and we have maintained the friendship across 5 decades of professional and personal life, which is the length of a friendship that produces the specific understanding between people who have known each other across multiple iterations of who they have been. I called Marianne in January, 2 weeks after I had heard Nathan and Sandra in the living room, and 1 week after the cameras went up. I told her what I had heard and what I was planning and what I needed from her. She listened with the specific quality that Marianne brings to professional consultations, fully present, asking the clarifying questions at the right moments, not directing the account, but ensuring it is complete. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, You're going to perform cognitive impairment until they make their move. Yes, I said. And you need me to provide a professional assessment confirming your cognitive status, she said. Yes, a formal assessment documented, done in the last 2 months, current. I'll schedule it for next week, she said. Standard battery documented, signed. And B, keep the camera recordings. They're gold in a theft case. I know, I said. You've already thought about all of this, she said. I've been a psychologist for 31 years, I said. I've done elder assessment. I know what the cases look like. The difference, she said, is that you're the subject and the architect simultaneously. Yes, I said. That's the interesting part. The assessment took place the following Thursday at Marianne's office. It was a comprehensive battery. The mini mental state examination, the Montreal cognitive assessment, the clock drawing test, the trail making test, the verbal fluency measures, and the more detailed neuropsychological testing that distinguishes between the screening tools and the formal assessment. Marianne administered and scored everything herself, with an additional evaluation from a neuropsychologist colleague she trusted. I want to describe the clock drawing test specifically because it is the test that is most vivid to me. In the clock drawing test, the subject is asked to draw a clock face and to set the hands to a specific time. It is a simple test whose simplicity conceals what it measures: spatial organization, numerical sequencing, executive planning, and the integration of multiple cognitive processes in a single brief task. I have administered this test to hundreds of patients across 31 years. I have watched people who have genuine dementia produce clocks that tell you, in their deviations and confusions, exactly what is being lost. I drew the clock in Marianne's office with the complete confidence of someone who knows the test's demands and has not lost any of the capacities it measures. The clock was perfect. The numbers were correct and proportional. The hands were placed precisely at 11 and 2, which is the standard specification. Marianne looked at it and said nothing. The neuropsychologist reviewing it afterward noted it in the formal report as performance consistent with above-average executive function. The results were what I knew they would be. No cognitive impairment in any domain. Processing speed in the age-appropriate normal range. Memory function above age norms. Executive function excellent. Language intact. The report was 22 pages. Marianne signed it. The neuropsychologist countersigned. The date was January 17th. I put the report in the safe in my study. I put the safe's combination in an envelope addressed to my attorney, Patricia Park, who had been practicing elder law in Colorado Springs for 20 years, and whose office had copies of all my relevant documents. The cameras continued to run. I want to tell you about the campaign that Nathan and Sandra ran between January and the April Saturday when everything concluded, because the campaign deserves a precise account rather than a summary. The campaign had 3 tracks running simultaneously. The first track was the neighbor track. Nathan and Sandra had, beginning in February, been speaking with several of my neighbors about what they described as concern about Mom's situation. I know this because the neighbors told me. Not all of them, but 3 of them, who came to me separately in the way of neighbors who were concerned, and who believe that I should know what is being said. One neighbor, a woman named Patricia Hines, who has known me since 1992, came on a Tuesday afternoon and said, "B, your son told me you've been getting confused. He asked me to keep an eye out. I wanted you to know." I had thanked Patricia and told her that I was fine and that I appreciated her telling me. I had also asked her, as gently as I could, not to share our conversation with Nathan or Sandra. She had agreed. The second track was the medical track. Nathan had, in February, called my primary care physician's office and requested, without my authorization, a referral for a cognitive assessment, citing family concerns about my mental status. My physician, Dr. Renata Kowalski, had called me to tell me about the request and to ask whether I wanted to proceed with an assessment. I told her I had already had a comprehensive assessment done privately and that I was fine. She noted this and told Nathan's request had been declined without my authorization. The third track was the legal track. In March, I received a letter from an attorney whose name I did not recognize, addressed to me, inquiring about the arrangements for your care and the management of your assets. The letter was phrased carefully. It was not threatening in a direct way, but its content was the content of a letter sent on behalf of someone who is beginning the process of establishing legal authority over another person's affairs. The language was the language of guardianship petitions, the expressions of concern, the references to assessment, the indirect suggestion that current arrangements were not sufficient. I sent the letter to Patricia Park without responding to the sender. Patricia called me the same day she received it. She said, "They've engaged a guardianship attorney." "Yes," I said. "How are you positioned?" she said. "How are you positioned?" she said. "How are you positioned?" "The cameras have been running for 3 months," I said. "I have a formal cognitive assessment from Marianne Wolfe dated January 17. I have the driveway recording from Nathan's first visit after the name forgetting began, in which he calls Sandra and tells her that I clearly don't know who he is anymore. I have 14 subsequent recordings of various relevant conversations. And the current psychiatric report," she said. 22 pages, 2 signatures, January 17th, I said. She was quiet for a moment. "Have you been planning this the whole time?" "Since December," I said. "What are you waiting for?" she said. "What are you waiting for?" "For them to make the move. I know they're planning," I said. "I need the action on tape, not just the conversation about it. A recording of people discussing removing furniture is ambiguous. A recording of people actually removing furniture combined with the recording of the planning conversation is not ambiguous." She was quiet again. "Be careful," she said. "I'm a psychologist," I said. "Careful is my professional disposition." 31 years of clinical psychology is 31 years of listening to what people say and understanding what they mean and watching the gap between the two. The gap is always there. In some people it is small, and in some people it is large, and in some people the gap is so large that the navigation of it has become the central organizing feature of their psychology. I came to psychology through the specific path of a woman who had been told as a child that she was too perceptive for her own good. My mother had said this to me more than once, and she had said it in the way that people say things that are meant as criticism, but that actually describe a genuine capacity. I was perceptive. I noticed things that other people did not notice, and the noticing was discomforting for people who had decided not to notice those things. The clinical psychology training had given the noticing a framework, had given me the vocabulary and the method for understanding what I was observing, rather than simply observing it. The 31 years of practice had refined the observational capacity to the point where it was not effort, but attention. I noticed things not because I was trying to notice them, but because noticing was what my mind did. What my mind had been noticing since October of the previous year, when Nathan and Sandra's visits began to have the campaign quality, was the accumulation of a specific pattern. The pattern was the assessment of my home and my capacities, conducted systematically across multiple visits, combined with the building of a narrative, told to neighbors, to my physician, to each other, that I was diminished, combined with the legal consultation that the guardianship attorney letter represented. The pattern was familiar to me from 31 years of clinical work and from the specific subspecialty of elder psychology that I had developed in the last decade of my practice. Elder financial abuse and the misuse of guardianship proceedings are documented phenomena in the clinical and legal literature. The pattern Nathan and Sandra were running was not novel. It had specific recognizable features and a specific recognizable trajectory, and the trajectory ended, in the cases I had seen professionally, either with the elder losing control of their assets and their living situation, or with early and robust intervention. The features I recognized from my clinical work, the gradual construction of a narrative of decline, shared with third parties, neighbors, physicians, to build an external record that would support the legal petition, the inventory taking of assets, which I had observed in Sandra's specific way of moving through rooms during her visits, the legal engagement which always preceded or accompanied the final action in the cases I had seen, and the timing pressure. "We need to move soon," Nathan had said, which reflects the knowledge that an elder who is not yet legally incapacitated can undo the legal process if they have time to understand what is happening. The timing pressure was the most diagnostically significant feature. In legitimate family concern, there is rarely urgency. The urgency in elder financial abuse cases comes from the knowledge that the window of apparent cognitive impairment might close, and from legal advice that swift action is better than delayed action when circumstances appear favorable. Every case I had seen in professional practice where an elder had ultimately been stripped of their assets or their autonomy had this urgency feature in the early stages. I was intervening robustly. The intervention required the performance, which had required the preparation, which had required the understanding. The specific psychological phenomenon I was exploiting was the confirmation bias of people who have decided what they are looking at. Once Nathan and Sandra had formed the hypothesis that I was cognitively impaired, they were looking for evidence that confirmed the hypothesis and were less attentive to evidence that disconfirmed it. The name forgetting was confirming evidence. My continued ability to manage the house, to speak coherently, to engage with the world, these were being filtered through the confirmation bias and reinterpreted. "She's having a good day. She manages the routine things all right. It comes and then goes." This is how confirmation bias works in clinical contexts. I had taught it to graduate students. I was now using my knowledge of it to manage my own children. The management required the performance, and the performance required a very specific thing: the appearance of confusion about identity, the names, the faces, while maintaining the functional competence that made clear I was not a danger to myself or my home. This calibration is the specific presentation pattern of early-stage dementia that still allows functional independence, and I had calibrated it precisely because I understood the presentation from the inside of 31 years of assessment. By April, the camera recordings had accumulated into a body of evidence that Patricia Park had reviewed, and that Marianne Wolfe had reviewed, and that I had reviewed repeatedly with the attention of someone who knows she is going to need to present this evidence to a police officer and then potentially to a court. The recordings documented the following specific items: a conversation in the living room in February, in which Nathan and Sandra discussed getting the furniture appraised before we do anything official, with Sandra saying the pieces in the dining room are probably worth something real. A phone call captured on the entryway camera in March, in which Nathan said, "We're going to need to move soon. The attorney says the longer we wait, the more complicated it gets." A kitchen conversation in early April, in which Sandra said, while walking through the kitchen with the specific attention of a person conducting an inventory, "The china is her mother's set. It would be rude to sell it before, but after," and did not finish the sentence. The after was the word that confirmed the trajectory. After was the word for after the guardianship proceeding, after the legal authority was established, after I was in a managed facility or otherwise removed from the house. The specific item I had been waiting for came in the second week of April. Nathan and Sandra came together, which was unusual. They typically visited separately. They came on a Wednesday afternoon, and I received them with the appropriate confusion, looking at Nathan and saying hello without using his name, looking at Sandra and saying, "Are you the woman from the senior center?" And then I made tea, and I sat at the kitchen table, and I let them talk. What they talked about in the kitchen of my house while I sat across from them and appeared confused was the plan, not in the explicit language of people who are knowingly committing a crime. They had both learned not to be explicit in front of me, but in the coded language of people who have decided something and who are arranging the implementation. Sandra said, "We should start with the dining room. The table and chairs are the most valuable pieces." Nathan said, "The timing needs to be this week. The attorney says the petition can go in next Monday. if we have the documentation ready. Sandra said, "She won't know what's happening anyway. She barely remembers our names." Nathan said, "Let's get what we can now and deal with the rest when things are official." I drank my tea. I looked out the window with the expression of a woman whose thoughts are somewhere else. The camera was running. Everything was captured. After they left, I called Patricia Park. I called Marianne Wolfe. I called the Colorado Springs Police Department's non-emergency line and spoke to an officer about what to do when I believed a theft was about to occur at my home. I noted it. I prepared for Saturday. They came at 9 in the morning on a Saturday in mid-April, which made sense. Saturday morning is when people move furniture because the weekday traffic is absent and the rental trucks are available. They had brought a rented moving truck, which I saw from the study window when I heard the door. I went to the living room. I sat in the armchair. I had my tea. I was wearing the expression of a woman who has been distracted from whatever she was thinking about, and who is now simply present to what is happening around her. Nathan said, "Mom, we're going to do some cleaning up today, organizing some of the furniture." "Oh," I said. "All right," Sandra said. "It might be a little noisy. You might want to go upstairs and rest." "I'm fine here," I said. They looked at each other. The look had the specific quality of a look between people who have a plan and who are in the process of executing the plan and who want the obstacle, me, to be somewhere other than where she was. "We'll work around you," Nathan said. They began with the dining room, as Sandra had said. The dining room table is a 1940s mahogany piece that belonged to my husband's grandmother. It came to us from Kwame's family in 1989, when his grandmother died, and it is a beautiful piece of real quality. The chairs are matching. Sandra had correctly assessed the set as valuable. I heard them moving the chairs. I heard them discussing the table. I heard Nathan say, from the dining room, "The table's too heavy to move without the dolly." "Did you bring the dolly?" Sandra said. "It's in the truck." While Nathan went to the truck for the dolly, Sandra came into the living room. She looked at me, at the woman sitting in the armchair with her tea, apparently unaware of what was happening, and she said, "Mom, you okay?" "I'm fine, dear," I said. She nodded. She went back to the dining room. I watched the loading begin. The chairs went first, carried by Nathan and Sandra together through the front door and down to the truck. Then the table with the dolly and considerable effort. Then, when the dining room was clear, they moved to the living room. The side table that had been Quam's mother's, the cabinet that contained my best china, the two table lamps that were genuine antiques. While they were loading the china cabinet, this was the moment I had calculated. I went to the kitchen. I took my phone from the counter. I dialed 911, 911. "What is your emergency?" The operator said. "My name is Beatrice Ellen Hartman Osei," I said. "I am at 4217 Mariposa Drive in Colorado Springs. I am calling to report a burglary in progress. Two people, a man and a woman, are removing furniture and antiques from my home without my authorization. They are loading the items into a moving truck currently parked in my driveway." The operator said, "Are you in a safe location?" "I am in my kitchen," I said. "The individuals in question are my children, Nathan Allen Hartman Osei and Sandra Claire Hartman Osei. I want to be clear that they are removing my property without my consent and in the process of a planned guardianship fraud. I have camera recordings of the planning conversations and a current psychiatric assessment confirming my competence. I would like the police to respond immediately." The operator said they were sending units. I thanked her. I put the phone in my pocket. I went back to the living room. I sat in the armchair. I picked up my tea. The police arrived 12 minutes after the 911 call. Two officers, a man and a woman, who came up the front walk while Nathan and Sandra were carrying a rolled carpet down the front steps. The carpet had been in the living room since 1994. It is a Tabriz wool carpet that Kwame and I had purchased in Seattle from an importer, and it is the most visually dramatic piece in the house. Nathan saw the police on the front walk. He stopped. Sandra, who was at the truck end of the carpet and could not see the walk, said, "What police?" Nathan said. The female officer said, "Good morning. We received a call about a burglary at this address. Can you tell me what's happening here?" Nathan said, We're helping our mother. She needs things organized. I came to the front door. I stood in the doorway." The male officer looked at me. "Are you the owner of the property?" he said. "Yes," I said. "My name is Beatrice Ellen Hartman Oze. I own this property. These individuals," I gestured at Nathan and Sandra, "are my children, Nathan Allen Hartman Oze and Sandra Claire Hartman Oze. They have been removing my property from the house without my authorization. I did not give permission for any removal," Nathan said. "Mom, you said we could help organize." I said, "No such thing," I said. I said it clearly and without the blankness of the performance. The performance was over. The female officer said, "Ma'am, are you saying these individuals are taking your property without your consent?" "Yes," I said. I have camera recordings of the planning conversations in which they discuss removing the furniture. In advance of a guardianship petition they have filed with the assistance of an attorney named—" I gave the attorney's name, which I had memorized. From the letter, I also have a formal psychiatric assessment dated January 17 of this year, conducted by Dr. Mary Ann Wolfe of Colorado Springs, which documents my complete cognitive competence. I will be happy to provide both to the responding officers. The officers exchanged a look. The male officer said, "Can you recite some identifying information for me? Your address, your date of birth?" 4217 Mariposa Drive, Colorado Springs, Colorado 8904. I said, "Date of birth, July 22nd, 1951. Social Security number." I gave it. "My son's name is Nathan Allen Hartman Oze. His date of birth is March 8, 1975. His Social Security number, which I know because I completed his tax documentation until he was 26, is—" I gave it. "My daughter's name is Sandra Claire Hartman Oze. Her date of birth is November 14th, 1977. She currently works as a healthcare administrator at Rocky Mountain Regional Medical Center. The name of the guardianship attorney they retained is—" I gave the name again and the address of the attorney's office and the approximate date of the initial engagement based on the letter I had received. I then provided the license plate number of the rented moving truck, which I had noted when I saw it in the driveway from the study window. I provided the name of the moving truck rental company. I provided the make and model of Nathan's personal vehicle, which was parked on the street. The male officer was writing. The female officer was looking at me with the specific expression that police officers develop across years of responding to calls in which one party's account is dramatically different from what was expected. She said quietly, "How do you know all of that?" "I am a retired clinical psychologist," I said. "I have a PhD from the University of Colorado. I spent 31 years in practice. I remember things. I have been remembering things very carefully for the past 4 months." The officers looked at Nathan and Sandra. Nathan had the expression of someone who has been standing in quicksand and has just understood what quicksand is. Sandra said, She hasn't known our names for weeks." "I know your names," I said. "I have known your names since the hours and minutes of your births. I know your social security numbers and your employers and the names of your attorneys and the content of the conversations you have conducted in my house across the past 4 months, all of which has been captured by the cameras I installed in January." I paused. "I may forget your names sometimes. I will never forget what you have done with them." The police detained Nathan and Sandra at the property while they reviewed the initial documentation I provided. I brought the camera recordings to the officers on a USB drive that I had prepared in advance and kept in my study, and the officers reviewed key clips on a laptop that one of them carried. The clips took 40 minutes to review. During those 40 minutes, Nathan and Sandra sat on the porch steps under the observation of one of the officers, and I made coffee in the kitchen. Patricia Park arrived at the property at 11:15. I had called her as soon as the police had arrived, and she had come from her home 15 minutes away, which is what happens when you have had an attorney on standby for 3 months. Marianne Wolfe arrived at 11:45. She had her assessment documentation and her clinical notes and the additional material she had prepared in January against the possibility of exactly this moment. The conversation between the police officers, Patricia Park, Marianne Wolfe, and myself lasted approximately 2 hours. The conversation was professional and specific. Patricia presented the documentation of the guardianship attorney contact. Marianne presented the cognitive assessment. I presented the camera recordings, which I had organized into a viewing order that told the story efficiently. The December living room conversation, the February furniture discussion, the March phone call about timing, the April kitchen conversation about after, and the Saturday morning removal. Nathan and Sandra were taken to the police station. I was informed that the case would be reviewed by the district attorney's office and that charges would be determined based on the evidence. The charges that were subsequently filed were attempted theft, elder financial abuse, and fraud in connection with the guardianship petition that had been filed. The petition, the police determined, had included statements about my cognitive status that were fabricated, which made the petition itself a fraudulent document. The guardianship petition was withdrawn. It was withdrawn because the filing attorney, upon receiving Patricia Park's letter and the formal psychiatric assessment, withdrew it himself. He had been provided with false information about my status, and the filing of a petition on false information was not a risk he was prepared to continue bearing. The property in the truck, the dining room set, the carpet, the china cabinet, the side table, the carpet went back on the living room floor. The china cabinet went back to its position. The dining room set was reinstalled by a moving company that I hired the following Monday. I walked through the restored house on Monday evening after the movers left. The house was its own house again, with its own contents and their own positions. The Tabriz carpet was on the living room floor. The mahogany table was in the dining room with its chairs. Quam's grandmother's furniture was where it belonged. I sat in the armchair. I had tea. My husband Kwame died in 2016. He was 70 years old, which is not old by contemporary standards, and which felt in the aftermath of his death much too young. He had been a professor of international relations at the University of Colorado, and his specific professional quality was the ability to understand the dynamics of power in complex situations, to see who had leverage and who did not, and what the leverage was actually organized around. He would have seen what Nathan and Sandra were doing, and he would have said so. This is one of the things I missed most after his death. The specific clarity of his assessments, which were always accurate, and which I had relied on for 40 years as a second pair of eyes for the situations that proximity makes harder to see correctly. I had been his second pair of eyes, too, in different ways. The clinical training had given me a different instrument from his. His was the political and historical analysis. Mine was the psychological. And the combination had been, across 40 years, better than either alone. Without him, I had been the single pair of eyes on my own situation, which is harder. The performance of the forgetting had been harder without him there to confirm the assessment. I had been certain of what I observed. But certainty without a trusted witness is a different kind of certainty than certainty with one. Marianne was the trusted witness I had used in his absence. Marianne, who had known me for 50 years, who had done the cognitive assessment that confirmed what I knew about myself, who had been the person I called in January when I understood what I was going to have to do. Kwame would have found the performance amusing. He had a specific quality of appreciation for the strategic use of apparent weakness. It was a recurring theme in the international relations literature he worked with. The way that parties who appear weaker than they are can accumulate advantage by allowing the stronger party to underestimate them. He had taught this principle for 30 years. I had applied it against my own children. He would have also, I think, understood the grief in the application. He had loved Nathan and Sandra the way that fathers love their children. With the specific warmth of a man who has invested deeply in the people his children were going to become. The people they had become and the plan they had run against their mother would have been painful for him in the specific way that discoveries about one's children are painful, not because the love stops, but because the love coexists with the thea, knowledge, and the coexistence is what makes the knowledge hard. He had said to me once in the middle years of our marriage when we were discussing a particularly difficult case I had been consulting on, a case involving an elderly man whose children had been manipulating his estate, that he thought the hardest thing a person could do was hold love and judgment simultaneously without letting either cancel the other. He had said, "In my field, we see governments do terrible things and we still study the governing system, still find the structural logic, still resist the simplification of pure condemnation. The complexity is harder to hold than the simple position, but it's the one that's actually true." He had looked at me and said, "I suspect you know this from your work." I had said, "Every day. I am living with the knowledge and the love simultaneously." This is what the aftermath has been. The criminal proceedings and the civil processes and the specific legal resolution, all proceeding with their own pace and their own requirements, while I am at home in the house with the dining room table back in its place and the carpet on the floor. The love does not stop when the knowledge arrives. The love changes its character. It becomes less easy, more complicated, the love of someone who knows the full picture rather than the partial one. But it does not stop. This is one of the things I would tell Kwame if he were here. I would say, I love them still. And I would also say, it changes nothing about what needed to happen. He would have nodded. He would have understood both. The criminal proceedings took 9 months. I will not describe them in exhaustive detail, because legal proceedings require their own pacing. That is not the pacing of this account. What I can tell you is what the evidence produced and what the evidence meant. The camera recordings were admissible. Colorado is a one-party consent state for audio recording in a private residence, and the cameras in my home, installed by me in my home, capturing conversations that occurred in my home, were within the legal framework for such recordings. The recordings covering 4 months of conversations that documented the planning of the furniture removal and the parallel guardianship proceeding constituted significant evidence of premeditation and conspiracy. The psychiatric assessment by Dr. Wolf was admitted as expert testimony. Marianne testified about the assessment, about its findings, about the specific cognitive measures that demonstrated intact function, and about the clinical distinction between genuine cognitive impairment and the performance of cognitive impairment. Her testimony was specific and documented, and the opposing counsel's challenges to it did not succeed. The guardianship petition's fraudulent character, the false statements about my cognitive status that had been provided to the filing attorney, was established through the combination of the psychiatric assessment and the camera recordings, which showed Nathan and Sandra constructing a false narrative about my condition while privately discussing the furniture removal. Nathan entered a plea agreement. The specific terms of the plea I will not reproduce here, because certain elements of it are not public record, and because I am not interested in performing the vindication that a detailed account of someone else's punishment provides. What I will say is that the plea included financial restitution, a period of probation, and the withdrawal of any claims against my estate or my person. Sandra went to trial. The trial lasted 4 days. The jury was out for 8 hours. She was convicted of elder financial abuse and fraud. The sentence included community service, probation, and the same financial restitution as Nathan's plea. The guardianship attorney had his license reviewed by the Colorado Bar Association. He had been provided with false information and had acted on it, which the bar's review assessed as a failure of due diligence rather than participation in the fraud. He received a formal censure and mandatory ethics training. Patricia Park filed a civil action in addition to the criminal proceedings, and the civil action produced a judgment that covered my legal fees and the assessed value of the distress caused by the campaign. The judgment is in the record. After the criminal proceedings were complete, I stayed in the house. I did not move, I did not sell, I did not make any change to the property that the events had not already made. The dining room table was in the dining room. The carpet was on the floor. The china was in the cabinet. I changed the locks. This was the specific practical change I made, and it was the right one. It is November. The legal proceedings are complete. The house is my house, in the full and uncontested sense. The cameras are still in the house. I saw no reason to remove them, and the presence of cameras in a house where a burglary was attempted is not unreasonable. But the recordings have the quality now of a silent observer rather than an active documentation project. Mary Ann came for dinner last week. We sat at the dining room table and I served the dinner I had made, and we talked about the year and about the case, and about the things that do not change, and the things that do not change, and the things that do. She is the kind of friend who can hold the complicated emotional reality of a situation, the combination of the vindication and the grief, without requiring either to be simpler than it is. "How are you?" she said over dinner. "Better than I was in December," I said. "And Nathan and Sandra," she said, "are my children," I said. "That fact does not change based on what happened." "Will you see them?" she said. "Not yet," I said. "There is a process for that, and the process requires things that aren't in place yet. Acknowledgement, understanding, the willingness to be honest about what they did and why. If those things develop, the question of seeing them is a different question from what it is now. And if they don't develop," she said, "then I will have learned what there was to learn," I said, "and I will live with the knowledge." She nodded. She knows me well enough to know that the knowledge I am describing is not the knowledge of a bitter person, but the knowledge of a realistic one. I spent 31 years in clinical practice. I know what genuine change looks like, and I know what its conditions are, and I know the difference between the change that is possible and the change that is wished for. I have been doing something specific since the proceedings concluded, which is writing, not the clinical writing of my professional years, the case notes and the assessment reports and the journal articles, the personal writing of someone who has been through something that needs to be understood rather than simply documented. This account is part of that writing. What do I know? At 73, after the December discovery and the January cameras and the performance and the April Saturday and the 9 months of proceedings, I know that the gap between what people say and what they mean is the most important gap in human relationships, and that the clinical training to read the gap is a gift and also a burden, because once you can read the gap, you cannot unread it. Reading it in the conversations of your own children is a different experience from reading it in the conversations of patients you are paid to understand. I know that the performance of confusion was the most difficult professional task I have undertaken, more difficult than any assessment I have conducted, because the subject of the performance was the performance of the absence of the very capacity that the performance required. To convincingly perform the loss of the thing you most fully possess is a specific kind of effort that I would not have believed I could sustain for 2 months if I had not sustained it. I know that the house is the house. The dining room table is the dining room table. The carpet is on the floor where it has been since 1994. These facts have a specific comfort in a situation where other facts are complicated. The objects in a house that has been a home for 30 years are the continuity of the life lived there, and their presence is not merely the presence of objects, but the presence of the time they have been in the room. I know that I may forget many things in the years ahead. This is the honest reckoning of a 73-year-old psychologist with a family history that includes some dementia in the upper branches. The forgetting I performed in March may eventually become the forgetting I live with rather than enact. If it does, the legal and professional preparations I have made, the documents with Patricia Park, the standing power of attorney with Marianne, the clear record of my current and recent competence, will serve the purpose they were designed to serve. And I know this. I said to the police officers, and I meant it, that I may forget names. I have not forgotten the people who used their names against me. The distinction is the one that matters. The cameras are running. The table is in its place. Marianne is coming again on Thursday. The house is mine. It was always mine.